All right, the meeting of the WSD on the evening of December 17 will come to order. This meeting is a hybrid meeting, which means that some or all of the public body is meeting remotely and some are meeting physically in a previously noticed location where the public may attend to observe, listen, and participate contemporaneously. Please note that while we will strive to provide means for those attending remotely to participate in the public comment period, there may be technical difficulties or reasons that otherwise prevent or interrupt remote public participation. Therefore, it is important to note that the open meeting law only ensures the public's right to participate and comment at a public meeting by attending at the designated physical location as posted in the notice and agenda. If a member of the public or the public body has technical difficulties accessing this meeting remotely, please alert us by email. In the event of a technical difficulty that cannot be resolved, we may continue the meeting if necessary to time and place certain. Just a reminder, and this is on the agenda, if appropriate, agenda items are subject to potential action. If any board member feels that an item on the consent agenda warrants discussion, then that item will be removed from the consent agenda and will be set aside for discussion. In this way, the consent agenda will be approved by a single motion. That request should be made before we come to the consent agenda. And of course, there's only one thing on the consent agenda. Amendments to the agenda. Due to scheduling conflicts, Emily Kornheiser is our guest tonight. Emily is a member of the Vermont House of Representatives, representing Brattleboro, and she is chair of the House and Means Committee. Thank you. Thank you, Emily, for attending. Let's begin with student matters. If there are any students online who would like to offer comment, questions, suggestions, now is the time. And we'll give it another meeting. I don't see any students online right now. Give it a couple of minutes. Okay. I'm going to move on to public comment on non-agenda items. This is a time for the board to listen and to take notes. It is not a time for the board to respond to comment or to engage in dialogue with the public. If appropriate, the board and administration will work on next steps. So this is time for public comment on non-agenda items. Yes, Matt Shibley.
Madam Chair, point of order. I'm flying solo tonight for notes, so I would kindly request that any public person speaking in public comment notify themselves by name and location so that I can accurately reflect that in the notes, please.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jody Normandin.
From Dummerston. I thought this was just strictly financial tonight, so I didn't even look at the agenda. Are there other items on the agenda?
Just a few basic housekeeping issues.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but it is a regular board meeting. It's taking place of a board meeting on December 25.
Thank you.
Yes. So, yeah, we're gonna move through these items quickly. Okay, any public comment on non-agenda items? Sure. Yes, would you identify yourself by name and by town?
Hi, I'm Eileen Hayes Arama. I am working at Brattleboro Middle School, and I have a daughter in the high school. And I just wanted to take a moment. I haven't spoken as a community member for a while, but I want to say that I've been able to do some work towards my agenda, which is advocating for students learning how to have discourse and conversation and open dialogue, even if it's difficult, and learning more about civics and how our government works and how we've always built on that and gotten stronger and stronger, and the ways in which we haven't gotten stronger, and having an ability and a place for students to learn how to advocate for themselves, how to advocate for our cause, and I think that's really important. So I'm still hoping now we're going to move forward. I will say that I have met with Mark Spino, and I appreciate that so very much, and I've been put with Jen Kramer, who we're gonna start talking about creating some sort of curriculum or guideline to introduce. I've met with teachers who are already doing this work, and they're brilliant over at BAMS. I'm very pleased about that, and I would like to say that at some point in the future, I'd like to offer myself and other people who feel this way with me in our community, local and throughout Vermont. We'd like to offer to the board perhaps a little PowerPoint presentation, something along those lines, so that we can show you what we've been working on collectively, especially with regard to understanding better the situation in the Middle East. Most of us are from that region or have lived in that region, and also ties to a greater understanding of the Holocaust, which I know that is being presented as part of the curriculum for studies in this area. So I would like at some point perhaps to have a few of my fellow collaborators come and present to the board. And so I'd like to propose that sometime down the future. So thank you, that's it.
Thank you. Would you please send me an email to that effect?
I will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment on non-agenda items? Okay, I don't see any hands. So, moving through the agenda, we are up to board matters and any updates from leadership councils at this point? Would you identify yourself, please?
Matt Shibley, board member. I am really excited to report back from the Green Street Leadership Council and just some of the tremendous work that Kate and her team are doing, particularly around a presentation, some professional development that they did around executive functioning and social emotional learning. I thought it was spot on. And so just wanted to sort of tout that and the good work that Kate and Green Street are doing. Leadership Council is also exploring ways to celebrate staff, having been inspired by the BAMS Leadership Council team. So really great stuff happening at Green Street.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Kim Price, the Putney Leadership Council. John's done a great job. He has topics for every month upcoming, so everything's already set. They did ask, one of the council members asked about having student reps join the Leadership Council, and I don't think that that's allowed. I haven't looked at the policy yet, but I said it's something we'd have to check.
Okay, my understanding about leadership councils is that the students on a given leadership council should come from the given school.
Right, yes, no, it would be because they have middle schoolers.
Yes, and
But I was not sure.
I do believe H7 does say student representation if appropriate.
Yes.
I do believe it does say
Okay.
that. Ann is looking it up right
Yes,
now.
I said I would
Yes.
bring it to our meeting because we were having one
Right,
and check on that. Though I do have a dilemma now because I am on the negotiations and that is every Thursday.
Mhm.
And I will not be able to attend Putney and I don't want to just send a report. I think it's important that somebody's physically there or on Zoom and I will be unable to do that. So I don't know if there's somebody who can trade, as long as they don't meet on Thursdays. But just putting that out there for right now.
Students when appropriate.
Students when appropriate.
Perfect.
Yes.
Then I will bring that back.
Okay, all right, so you are unable, this is because they meet on Thursdays.
Meeting on Thursdays at
And this will be, through the end
February.
of February.
Yes.
So we're talking 2 months.
Yes, two
January,
meetings.
2 meetings, January
But
and
then
February.
We usually after the elections in March, we reassign everything. so-
Right, okay.
So,
All right, we're putting that out there.
just putting that out
All right,
there.
okay, thank you. Anyone else? Leadership Council updates? All right, I'm gonna move on. Next item, board subcommittees and supervisory union updates. Tim, I saw your
No.
hand. No? Okay. Mhm. Okay, Ruby.
I'm starting to lose the thread of time here, so forgive me if this has already been shared. But at the last meeting, I shared that there was a subcommittee, the Farm to School Subcommittee. This has to do with SU business.
Yep.
Great,
on my list.
fantastic. Then I'm gonna hand the baton to Anne because I didn't do anything. It was just a really big news.
In SU business, we adopted our budget, which you will find the assessment for in the SD budget. But also we approved a recommendation from an ad hoc committee that grew out of the Farm to School Committee. And we are moving our food service operations to the district rather than going through an outside vendor. Similar to the way the Putney program has worked in Putney. Those are our big news from last week's meeting. And having approved the budget, we don't have a meeting tomorrow.
Great news. Yes. Great news. Anybody else for board subcommittees? Okay, other business? Other business. Tim, would you identify yourself, please?
Tim Maciel, Brattleboro. So we've had a couple of terrific presentations by Rachel Glickman, a staff member. We've just heard a really intriguing offer from Eileen Band, a staff member at BAMS. I hope this is a trend. I hope that staff members engage more and more with the board. There's nothing better than hearing directly from staff members what's happening, what the issues are, what the accomplishments are. So I hope it's the beginning of a trend.
Okay, thank you. Other business? I would like to throw a hint at BUHS, and since there is no SU meeting tomorrow evening, which is the 18th, Hannah Parker.
Yeah, everyone is welcome. Please come to our honors concert tomorrow night at 6:30 in the auditorium. It will be something you will not want to miss. All are welcome.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Deborah.
Great, you're welcome. Any other business? Okay, we are up to fiscal report, and we do have a guest. So are we going to do the fiscal presentation first, and then we move on to Emily Kornheiser, or how would you like to shuffle the deck here? It's between the two of you.
I think it would be great to have Emily lead off, but your preference.
Okay. Can I just, can I get another package, please?
Hmm.
Thank you. Okay, Emily, it's all yours. Thank
So
you.
I'm Emily Kornheiser. I'm one of 3 state representatives for Brattleboro, and I have the honor of chairing the House Ways and Means Committee this last biennium that's wrapping up, and likely chairing the House Ways and Means Committee this next biennium that starts on January 8th, I think. And I am here today to talk about sort of the statewide context that you are creating a budget within. And then you'll hear from your incredible leadership talking about the values-driven, strategy-driven, student-driven work that's happening here to create a budget. So slightly different frames for the conversation, but I just sort of want to say that. I also want to give myself a little out in that we were sort of going back and forth with scheduling me coming, and then it was just like an hour ago that we decided it would be tonight. So I'm not quite as prepared as I would like to be, but maybe I would have said that in 3 weeks. And so, take my excuses with whatever grain of salt you want to. If you don't mind, I'd love to just spend like 4 minutes in the Wayback Machine, because we never know when people enter this conversation, and sometimes that context is helpful. Is that okay? Yes. Okay, thank you. So in the 90s, most schools across the country were funded primarily by local property taxes. Oh, also caveat, I'm the chair of House Ways and Means Committee. We talk about taxes and funding. There is a House Education Committee and a Senate Education Committee that focuses their energy on the incredible children and families and educators in this state. I spend most of my time thinking about numbers, and my job is to make sure there is sufficient revenue to meet the needs of the amazing kids, families, educators in this state. But I'm like more numbers, less kids, generally, when I'm talking. So again, caveat that. So in the 90s, most schools across the country were funded primarily by local property taxes. As all of us know that were around in the 90s anywhere in this country, that created huge disparities in access to quality education. And wealthier communities were and still are in some places able to provide a much higher quality of education than their less wealthy counterparts, sometimes one town right next to another. These disparities led to numerous lawsuits all across the country, including in Vermont. However, in Vermont, due to a very specific part of our Constitution, our Vermont Constitution, Chapter 2, subsection 68, for anyone who wants to look it up at home, the lawsuits here prevailed, which resulted in a decision by the legislature that next biennium to create Act 60 and Act 68, the biennium that followed that. So that's generally referred to as the Brigham decision, and then Act 60. So Act 60 meant a huge shift in how we fund schools in Vermont. It sought to provide more equitable funding across districts. And while Act 60 appeared to preserve local control, the funding system was actually shifted to an entirely centralized model of raising funds. So it was local decision-making about how much to spend, but an entirely centralized system of how those funds are raised. With the state collecting tax revenues and then redistributing them based on the district's grand list. That is a typo. Redistributing them based on a district's voted spending decisions and voted budget. And one of the big things that was new under Act 60 was that we used a statewide grand list rather than a community by community grand list, which meant that a tax rate in Brattleboro meant the same thing as a tax rate in Dover, where the property values might be very, very different. In doing that, in finding this sort of path to equity and sufficiency, we created a fairly complicated formula. And earlier today, I was remembering the first time I was at town meeting and I heard Frank explaining it all many moons ago before I thought about local politics at all, and like just sort of like the panic I had at listening to him talk about it. Even though he did a very good job and does it very regularly. It's not you, it's the formula. And while that formula, again, sort of appeared to blend local and statewide taxes, and I think sometimes even some town treasurers still talk about it as sort of a local and statewide mix, it is entirely a statewide tax that is collected locally on behalf of the state. The formula today remains both complex and nonlinear, and I really mean nonlinear in the mathematical sense, in that like a decision in one place does not immediately equal an equal reaction in the other place. And that's important because it means we often can't predict what a behavior in sort of one school, how that might impact the local tax rates, or how a behavior at a school across the state might impact our tax rates here. It creates, though, opportunities for local decision-making and fairness, but continued challenges in distribution, opportunity, and transparency. Over the last 30 years since that happened, along with the rest of rural America, we here in Brattleboro and Windham Southeast in Vermont have had a declining population of students and rapidly aging infrastructure. I think everyone already knows that. Additionally, the loss of federal and state social service funding over the last 30 years, that's been a continuous trend, has left schools to absorb those additional costs, and we do that valiantly here. And while the legislature has made several substantial tweaks to that funding system over the years, Act 46, Act 173, a whole slew of them, these adjustments often created unintended consequences or merely shifted costs to different buckets within the same system rather than addressing the root problem. So, brings me to the current day. Last year, a combination of factors accumulated into what we started referring to as the perfect storm. And I think you all know this, healthcare costs skyrocketed, student need post-pandemic surged, federal dollars dried up post-COVID, inflation hit the cost of heating and paper and everything else, and schools all over the state, including here, face deferred maintenance and some crumbling infrastructure. Additionally, changes in the formula for how we count students, something that I know, previous boards here worked really hard on, reduced tax capacity in some districts while creating more an inflationary pressure in other districts. And in further complications of that perfect storm, non-property tax revenues into the education fund, such as sales taxes, were lower than they had been for the last few years. And that was due to just sort of like standard decreased spending post-pandemic. There was sort of like a big surge in spending. We were all home and like buying weird stuff for our houses or feeling like, anyway, all that federal money was rolling around. And so people were spending a little bit less in sort of the aftershock of that. All of that sort of huge burst last year in budget projections all over the state resulted in what was expected to be a more than 20% average increase in property tax costs. And folks all over the state had very strong reactions to that for good reason. Even someone with like a very steady job, that is a lot of unexpected bills to be experiencing overnight. And those property tax responsibilities were really different from community to community. That meant some towns were seeing a 40% increase in their property taxes, while some towns actually saw a decrease. It was an average. And the reaction was loud. And frankly, it was actually a lot quieter here than it was in a lot of other areas of the state. But we saw a huge proportion of school budgets fail all over the state. And in that context, the legislature and all of our school boards and school leadership worked really hard to reduce those pressures in a fiscally responsible way. In the legislature, we added new revenue sources and we used one-time funds to bring the property tax projections down to around a 14% average, but still more than most folks can bear. And we reinstated the excess spending penalty as a way of controlling costs in these future years, because we knew that none of the things that happened last year were just one-time things. All of those pressures are still sitting in the budgets that we're looking at tonight. And it was clear that despite those sort of small, short-term things we could do, systemic change was needed. And we created a commission on the future of public education at that point. So the Commission on the Future of Public Education has been meeting since the summer to explore potential solutions. And while we understand the challenges, we know, and they know, that we need to make changes, both to reduce costs and to make our education system more effective and our community stronger. Vermonters, folks in Brattleboro, folks in Windham Southeast have all voiced concerns. And while there are really significant disagreements on the specifics of what needs to happen, I think there's broad agreement that some action is needed. One of the challenges about the fact that some action is needed is that there is no single solution that is going to do the trick. Otherwise, we probably would have done it already. And it's not just one policy change, it's likely many that might need to happen simultaneously, which is hard. It's hard for a system that's already quite stressed, and both Vermonters already feeling quite fiscally stressed, and schools already feeling quite stressed. The education work and the tax policy works are separate, but they're deeply interconnected, and it's really important that any policy change on one end is sort of incentivized on the other end, and the opposite of that. Ideas currently on the table include changes to healthcare, school sizes, tax structures, and more. And each of these changes will likely be disruptive to some districts around the state. And no community will likely be unaffected from the work that needs to happen. Likely, what we mean when we say local control will need to be reconsidered and really examined in the face of the equity needs of our students and the opportunities we want to offer them. And we're going to need to really fully understand the trade-offs that we're dealing with to make the strategic decisions we need to make in order to build a high-quality school system throughout the state that Vermonters can support and believe in. So in the upcoming session, we're going to focus on short-term adjustments that can give us the breathing room that we need to implement the longer-term changes. But likely those longer-term changes also need to begin this coming legislative session. And that commission's initial work is due this week. And while the report that they're turning in is very much an interim report and is not going to contain big, bold suggestions yet, they have not had time to really vet those fully. The work that they've done thus far is basically putting together a pretty comprehensive list of the ideas that are floating around in our communities, and that all of my legislative colleagues are going to arrive in Montpelier in January ready to look at. And so that's the work we're going to need to do. It's just a starting point though. And if we're going to move forward with a broad coordinated strategy, all of you and this exact conversation happening in every community in the state, we need to approach the changes with a mindset of and, not a mindset of or, which is very hard to do in a political context. Because only a comprehensive overhaul is likely to make sure that we are finding the quality and effectiveness that our kids deserve and a cost that Vermonters can afford. And our future, I think, depends on real sustainable solutions. And I know the budget sort of battles were not as heated here as they were in many other places. But we are in a situation right now where, teachers are leaving the workforce because they don't want to work in communities where their neighbors are not voting to fund their positions, right? Folks don't want to send their kids to a school that they know their neighbors aren't going to support, right? And so we're seeing if we're not careful, we are in danger of losing something that is so precious to Vermont, which is a school system that, the vast majority of Vermonters believe in so deeply and invest so much of their valuable time and valuable energy in. Everyone at all of these tables has their favorite party or their favorite policy to blame and their favorite solution. And I know when I met with Frank and Mark this morning, like their favorite policies and blames, you know, like every conversation that kicks in, and I could ask each of you, like, what do you think the problem is and what do you think the solution is? And each of you is likely to have a slightly different one. And every time I have this conversation, or one of my colleagues has this conversation, everyone says, every idea needs to be on the table. Except for this one, that's like my one that I don't want on the table. And if we add up all those conversations, guess what happens really fast? There's not a single idea on the table anymore. And so it's gonna be a really interesting process this year to say, like, how do we all have the resilience and trust and patience to fully examine all of these ideas, explore all of the trade-offs, and say, none of these are perfect. Many of them have to happen simultaneously, and I'm willing to manage this thing that might feel imperfect in the face of the greater good and all of our kids. And so what I'm hoping to do is like start this conversation with you all tonight in the context of the really responsible budgeting that's happening here. And come back regularly, maybe with more of my legislative colleagues, be meeting with Frank and Mark regularly, meeting with other superintendents in the region regularly to make sure that whatever we're doing is fully informed by the experiences of the kids and staff and amazing folks involved in Windham Southeast. So I am going to stop there. Thank you.
Questions, concerns? I'm looking to see, yes, would you identify yourself fully and your town, please?
I'm Laiba and I'm from Brattleboro. I really loved, you were so passionate about it. It was so cool to hear you talk about the school and everything. I just had a little question about, you said there has to be some change in school sizes and healthcare. What would be like your idea? Like I want to understand a little more on what you mean by changes in healthcare.
There's a huge sort of menu of ideas that we're working through. There's a bunch of different policy ideas around how to make sure that schools and classes are large enough that students can have all the opportunities that they deserve and get to see the diversity of experiences in their classrooms and in their schools that they deserve and can feel safe with. So there's a whole bunch of policy buckets related to that. There's a lot of policy work that we're discussing regarding how we send state dollars from one district to another, whether that's to a private school, to an independent school, or to another public school, and how in doing that we might reduce the scale, reduce the number of kids in a particular place, and that might not create the incentives we want. And then there's a lot of our budget, and Frank will talk about this, is being driven right now. About a fifth of the huge increase in spending right now is being driven by an increase in healthcare costs for staff. And that's true for like state employees too, and it's true for most businesses that provide comprehensive healthcare. Healthcare costs are just skyrocketing, particularly in Vermont, but in other places in the country as well. And so the folks who, healthcare in Vermont is bargained, healthcare for educators in Vermont is bargained at the state level rather than district by district. And so the folks who do that bargaining have decided basically to, they postponed this round of bargaining in the hopes that instead of just continuing to fight back and forth over sort of the scraps of a not very functional healthcare system, they want to take a pause and figure out how maybe they could repackage the whole conversation in order to be negotiating something slightly different. And like, to get further into details, I'd have to talk about like actuarial values of health insurance and stuff like that. That's like a little beyond my capacity, but that's part of it.
Jody?
Hi, Jody Humberto from Darmiston. you have kind of laid out the blame. And I am hoping, against all hope, that the legislature will take the same kind of situation and look at what they have done to our education. All the unfunded mandates, all the switching back, getting stuff out of the education fund and putting it in other places, you know all the stuff that's been happening. And that's a big amount. We have to do these things in our district and every district that the state says, whether it's you or the AOE or whatever. And you need to take not you personally, but you whatever. You need to take a really good look at what you have done in the past to put us where we are today. Because I think particularly this district has been a well-functioning district way before Act 46. The second thing you need to do, and was supposed to do in the law of Act 46, was to look at Act 46 to see whether it saved any money, whether it got a better education. There were 5 things in there that we were all supposed to do. Nothing has been done. And that's very common in the legislature. There's a lot of things that need to be relooked at and are supposed to be relooked at and never get relooked at. So I'm hoping that you as one person, and I'm going to talk to the rest of the reps around the place, that this happens because we need to see that. And I think our administrators, I think our principals and everybody, we pretty much know what we're doing down here and how we're doing it. And quite frankly, I'm getting tired of a top-down system. We're not talking to the teachers. We're not we. You aren't talking to the teachers. You aren't talking to the community. You aren't talking to the parents. And I think this has to happen. And I know the committee is hearing this over and over and over again also. And I think that's one of the reasons that they haven't made any proposals yet, because they're working on evidence. And they're not going to make I hope they do not make proposals until they get their evidence. So I hope you hear me.
With all due respect, I do think I personally spend a great deal of time talking to teachers and families and youth and all of that. And I think the legislature has actually taken an enormous amount of blame and responsibility for the state of property taxes right now. On the list of the comprehensive list of policy work that we're planning is a full audit of education fund costs. And that's going to be just as scary to everyone as all the other things on this list. That means looking at current use and how that spends money out of the education fund. That means looking at tax increment financing and how that spends money out of the education fund. And that includes, I have a lot of colleagues that are pushing very hard to remove the money remove the legislation for universal school meals, which I imagine is not something that this district is particularly interested in. So every piece of it, yes, is 100% going to be looked at. And one of the challenges that I really wrestle with is when we don't have state mandates for things like universal meals or pre-kindergarten. Different districts do it very differently. Here, we might have full day pre-K in some cases and universal meals, and soon have a really fantastic lunch program that is run within the district. Other districts might do a lot less than that and spend a lot less. And that creates different opportunities for kids from town to town and very different, but at the end of the day, every taxpayer in the whole state is paying for all of that. And that's a really hard part about the fact that we have this universal fund and local decision making. And so we're wrestling with all of that. And I'm really glad that I can be here and we can all be talking about all of it. As for looking at past legislative history, I think that's incredibly important. And we were talking about this earlier. Lessons learned from Act 46, lessons learned from Act 173, lessons learned from Act 127. And the Agency of Education was indeed tasked with doing reviews of all of those. frankly became something of a very dark joke in my committee last year because we kept on asking AOE for the reports that were not happening. And throughout the legislature, one of our sort of top 3 priorities this year is going to be to really like focus hugely on what have we done, what was the administration supposed to do with what we did, and how are Vermonters better off as a result of that.
Ruby.
Ruby McAdoo. Hi. I'm trying to wrap my head around a few things that I'm hearing and that I have been hearing for a few months, I guess now. I see you coming here and having a touch point and wanting to be more engaged. I see the commission, I can't remember what it's called, but on the betterment of public education.
Future of public education.
That. I think that the AOE interim person, Zoe Saunders came and had a listen and learn thing, or like that her staff came. And that was very clearly a statewide thing. I would like for you, because you started this off with those caveats and that idea of like, you're talking numbers, there's other policy work, there's other, bigger thinking around education. I'm confused, it feels like there should be intersectionality between all these things. There should be ways in which that you all are talking, like one group is talking to the other group and is informed. But I'm kind of concerned, like in the Ways and Means Committee equally, like your work, you're gonna be diving into things. Like how is your work going to be highly informed by that commission, highly informed by what's going on at the AOE? I can say that, I went to the Listen and Learn session. I wish more people had gone to the Listen and Learn session. I think there were it was really intriguing and interesting to get close to and hear directly, but I also heard words that were like a little alarming as well around that top-down kind of perspective. And I accept that there is no right and wrong way. There's no black and white. We have to make compromises, we have to figure things out, we really have to slog through and do this work. That feels like that's what's happening in all these spaces. So can you speak to how all of that work is feeding each other?
I appreciate that. And sorry I didn't set that up better actually, because it would be alarming if anyway. So the legislature created the Commission on the Future of Education and a subcommittee of that commission, an Education Finance Subcommittee. My colleague Peter Conlon, who's the chair of the House Education Committee, sits on the is a member of the full commission. I am the chair of the Education Finance Subcommittee of that full commission. We created those last year when it became very clear that there was a lot of work to do and we wanted to include a lot more people in that work. Part of that legislation that created the commission also mandated the commission have public meetings in every single region of the state and have a really comprehensive sort of communications and collaborations framework as part of it. Near the end of us being in that crisis and passing that legislation, the interim secretary was named interim secretary after having a series of various situations of secretaries and interim secretaries at AOE. They've been sort of under capacity for a very long time now, despite legislative attempts otherwise. The interim secretary, when she began her job, started a parallel process to the commission's process in order for her to basically get her feet under her, I think, and to understand what education meant in Vermont. And that is how she originally described the Listen and Learn tour. It was to go around and hear, as she was beginning her job and getting her head around what it meant to be Secretary of Education, what Vermonters wanted for education. I do not know why she decided to create a parallel process to the commission that was essentially asking those exact same questions and was already funded to have that comprehensive work, but that's what she did. She is, and we are trying to have her regularly bring that work that she's doing into the commission while the commission does that second round of public engagement. They have not come down here yet, but they're planning to. It's really important that it's integrated, not confusing. I'm really disappointed that the tour, the Listen and Learn tour, wasn't better promoted here and more people didn't know about it, myself included, right? Because it's really important that Vermonters and folks in this area have like every opportunity they can to participate in these conversations. And most people don't have the capacity to watch endless Teams meetings like Jody does and you know,
It's my age.
kind of feel like you've always had that passion. And so the more we can like actually show up in person and like talk to our neighbors about this stuff, I think the better off we are. So that's how those two pieces are connected. My colleague Peter Conlin and I have become, who's the chair of the House Education Committee and likely will be again, have become somewhat attached at the hip over the last year. We talk regularly, we meet almost every morning. When we talk to our caucus or to our colleagues, we always do it side by side and he covers education and I cover taxes. And when we talk to reporters, we're constantly referring one to the other. And so we're very connected and know that this is only gonna work if education policy and education finance reform happen simultaneously together. The way we're going to begin our work this year and build our work this year is by using the work that the Education Finance Subcommittee did with the full commission to basically create a list of policy possibilities. We're gonna use that to set our agendas for this session. Like item by item, that is how we're gonna build our testimony and our work before us this session. He's gonna take the sort of first half of the list, that's education policy. I'm gonna take the second half of the list, that's education finance, and we're gonna truck through that together. Anything that's sort of outside the purview of either of our committees, like the healthcare work, that is going to, the first few weeks of the session, every committee in the Vermont House is gonna be tasked with how does the education fund touch their work? You know, whether that is the ag committee working on current use, or whether that's a healthcare committee working on healthcare, or the human services committee working on mental health in our schools. And so we're gonna take that laundry list and farm it out to all of the committees to make sure that we are all working from sort of the same playbook and asking the same really important questions about like what are the policy goals, what's the fiscal scale, what are the contingencies or dependencies that might happen here, what are the trade-offs, and making sure we're sticking with actually the guiding principles that the commission set up when they began their work around equity, affordability, and quality. And so that's how the pieces fit together. Mm-hmm.
Eva?
You know, I talked to a lot of folks and they're completely frustrated with the whole entire setup of the system. That how is the education fund, how is it connected to property taxes? Is this equitable? Is this progressive? And with the health insurance costs, one of the conversations is is there a possibility for it to be separated out, that the healthcare cost is so volatile, and to have that impact and have that pressure in all the schools. And the healthcare industry has said, we're not going to reduce our costs. In fact, we're going to raise our costs over the next couple of years. So this is going to be an issue that comes up again and again. Is there conversations about removing the healthcare cost on the impact for schools and separating that out, and the state can figure out the revenue sources to raise money to pay for that? Because the thing when we're talking about making things affordable, I'm not hearing how we're going to raise money, because if the system is crumbling, the infrastructure is crumbling, we need social services, and you want it at an affordable cost, what does that mean? Because that sounds like to me we need money, but I could be wrong, so.
So every piece of the education fund, like I said, is on the table about whether it should stay there, whether it should move to the general fund or not. I will say the general fund is actually under more pressure probably than the education fund. And so I think there's sort of a desire for people who hang out with the education fund a lot to say, let's move it to the general fund. And a lot of the costs that are carried by the education fund, like right now, mental health care costs provided in the schools are covered by the education fund. I think there's a really good argument to be made those should be covered by the general fund. But schools have a legal responsibility to meet the needs of the kids in their care, federal legal responsibility, right? If there's a 504 or whatever. The mental health system, the designated mental health system that is chronically underfunded by the state does not have that same legal responsibility. They only provide care that they can essentially afford, right? And we see how that plays out all over the town. So I think sometimes we need to be careful what we ask for when we ask for things to move into a different fund, because it might become even less sufficient than it is now. That is not how I want the world to work, and very little about legislative service is about this like dream of how I want the world to work. A lot of it's harm reduction about how to make it sort of the best possible situation we have, given the resources in front of us. There are absolutely conversations about raising more revenue as part of this. There's also the political reality that the Democrats have a majority but not a supermajority. We have a Republican governor who's been very, very clear over and over and over again that he's not interested in raising any new taxes or fees. And so the political reality of how to add other new revenue into the system is fairly low. And while property taxes feel like an incredible blow to a lot of people's budgets, and they're one of the more progressive ways we can raise money. They're certainly better than increasing the sales tax in terms of the impact that it has on low-income people's budgets. And moving entirely to an income tax, there's real questions about that given the income base in Vermont and the changing demographics here and whether that would be a stable enough revenue source for us entirely long term. So those are sort of how those conversations are playing out. It isn't perfect, and each one of the sort of choices we'll need to make is a trade-off. And I'm really not here to defend any of those paths. I'm here to just talk about the trade-offs in all of those paths, because some of them are going to need to happen.
Sean Murphy.
Yeah, Sean Murphy. I really appreciate what you've been talking about. And one of the things that I look at is sort of the disconnect between the administration, the legislature, and the AOE. And it was illustrated very clearly by the veto of the yield bill last spring. And the legislature actually did the necessary work to override that veto. It was my understanding that if the veto had not been overturned, then the yield would have returned to the previous year, which would have left an unbelievable crater of need. And so you wouldn't have anywhere near the amount of money that is required, that $2.2 billion, to supply the state of Vermont with education funding needs. So I commend you and the legislature for realizing that's not going to work. We can't go into deficit spending on this huge problem. So it was courageous, I think, by the legislature, because they knew that the tax implication would be carried over to property owners. But they also knew that we had to do it in order to maintain the education system in Vermont that has to be maintained. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Sean. And it feels very naive to say this, but this is really a time for governance, not a time for politics. And that's a really hard stance to maintain in the face of a lot of politics. And I don't just mean politics from politicians, I mean politics from various stakeholder groups all over the state, various communities all over the state, but people really sort of protecting their own. And I'm really hopeful that we can all get through this with as much of an eye as possible on sort of kids and communities and governance if possible. And I just want to say, like, I'm not throwing out some of the ideas that are sort of a little sexier in sort of our context. Like, so we're talking about taxing second homes at a different rate, maybe a higher rate. And like, that's probably like a little gleaming star for a lot of people of excitement. It's also like not gonna be the one thing that fixes it all. So like, it's great, but it doesn't mean that there's not gonna be something else that needs to happen that's less great. So that's sort of some of the context that we're working in. And that we're building a budget in.
Other comment? Questions? Okay, I don't see anyone online. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We're ready to turn to the budget?
Well, let's take a 5-minute break, if you don't mind. It's 7 o'clock. Very much, brief break. And Emily, I'm glad you are still here to hear what we're about to hear. So, Frank, thank you very much.
I'll get it started real quick, Deborah.
Oh, I'm so sorry,
That's all
Mark.
right. And thank you, Emily, for being with us tonight. We're pleased to present what we strongly feel is a fiscally responsible budget this evening that also meets our improvement goals that we've been sharing regularly throughout the fall and winter. This plan is directly connected to our continuous improvement plan. And just a reminder, that plan includes 10% academic proficiency growth in math and literacy, a 10% increase in sense of belonging of our students, and improved graduation rates at UHS. On our website, we have documented all of our presentations. The most recent presentation titled, "To What Extent Are We Fiscally Responsible?" Directly supports this budget that we'll be presenting tonight. So with that context, I'll turn it over to Frank, and he will walk us through the various elements of this proposal this evening.
Okay, so everyone has a hard copy that's gone around and it's on the website. Just this morning, we received another adjustment on equalized students. Now the new term is long-term weighted average students. So if any of you happened to print out a couple of these front-loaded pages, we've made a little update. I'll go over those. But no major changes from the draft that was sent out earlier. And I think most of you have attended the Finance Committee meetings. And so what you see here represents the deliberations that we started with the Finance Committee back in November, on November 12th. We've had a series of meetings where we looked at, as Mark just said, a very deep dive into our goals, but drive our budget planning, all around about student outcomes, about closing gaps that exist, and being very dedicated and strategic around accomplishing those goals over the next fiscal year. On the 19th of November, we went over a pretty thorough review of the elementary school system proposals by school site. And then on the 25th of November, we went over the secondary proposal. And then on the 12th of the 2nd of December, we went over the revenues and the capital plan. So here we are on the 17th. I'm looking at the second page of the document of the timeline, the planning timeline. to sort of just look at a comprehensive document with really not any significant changes to what we have presented over the last couple of months. But I do have now the long-term weighted average rough draft from the Agency of Ed. So we'll look at how that defines fiscal responsibility and addresses some of the legislation that Emily has referred to around the legislature's leadership and concern about protecting our taxpayers from those sort of erratic changes. So we're gonna look at that. If we do spend just another moment on page 2 on the timeline, looking the road ahead, we buzz down to the annual meeting. That's the statutory requirement that March 18th we'll present a budget to the electorate. That's based on the Articles of Agreement that were agreed to back when this Windham Southeast School District was formed in 2019. And then from where we are today, the 17th, through January, in order for us to get the annual reports published and documents warned, we would need a board-approved budget on the 28th of January. And then that allows us to move forward with the printing file and then a warning of the March meeting on February 11th. So that meets that statutory requirement of between no earlier than 40 days, no less than 30 days prior to the vote. So that's the planning calendar I had, and then if you just take a moment, I wasn't planning on going through all a couple hundred pages here of the document, but I've certainly wanted to outline some of the highlights. So page 1, when we put all the parts together, you see total expenditures for the proposal starting July 2025, ending June 2026. That's what we call fiscal year 26. 67,783,000, up 1%, 1.2% versus the current budget of 66,988. As I mentioned last meeting, we reviewed the revenues. Those will be updated as we get more statistics from the Agency of Ed. Probably the single largest statistic that we haven't seen yet is the Career Technical Ed 6-semester average that derives a lot of revenue assumptions, and it derives some expenditure assumptions for this BUHS part of the funding formula that Emily's mentioned might get revisited. I hope it does. But the reason why you see an increase in revenue of 3.2%, you see that, versus a 1% increase in expenditures is because the substantial difference when you look down at the use of fund balance on the very bottom line of the financial figures. You see we, as a result of what Mark has outlined, what we've discussed at length before, what Emily raised, somewhat of a fiscal crisis last year. You recall at the March annual meeting, we proposed utilizing a substantially higher amount of reserves to mitigate those tax rate increases. And we were successful in doing that, but it was, you see that number, $2,048,000. This year, very preliminarily, I've got a $750,000 placeholder use of fund balance. But the difference there, that 1.3 million, has to be made up, and that's why revenues are higher than, in terms of a percent, are higher than the expenditure change. And unfortunately, that has to be made up from the ed fund. And that's where you see state sources up in the revenues, up 8%. And that's what drives taxes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That's how to understand spending, change in spending, and then sources of funds to pay for those plans. So the other note, bottom of page 1, you see the graph there. I just want to point out, as we have in our finance committees, the lighter blue and the darker blue are both really primarily direct instructional expenditures. Part of legislation back in 2012 said that supervisory unions will manage special education services and transportation, as well as finance and a number of other functions to operate public schools. And as a result, we have to report it in this uniform chart of accounts format. That's where special education assessments come into the district. So that smaller blue square that's 19% says support services, special education, central admin and transport. You see that? 19% plus that 49% in direct instruction is 68% is dedicated to the direct work with students in the classroom, and that's a very good statistic in terms of saying our by far our greatest investment is in the educational programs to support students. The other wedges there again follow the uniform chart of accounts. By the way, that's on the very last page 225. If you wanted to see the definitions of the codes, there they are. But as we said, 2,100 student support services. That's co-curricular, field trips, things like that. You see that 7%, and then the staff support services for instruction, that's the gray wedge, 4%. So that's professional development. That's where we would have our instructional coaches, library. It's services that support research and instruction for our teachers. And then you see board and school administration in the orange wedge, 7%, which is typical in public schools. And then finally, as you know, we've taken great measures to understand our assets and useful life. And you see the green there is facility maintenance, and we are not in any sort of disrepair or deferred maintenance mode. We're in very, very good shape as it relates to contemporary controls and heating systems. We've converted all of our schools to biofuels and to our 100% renewable energy. So we've done that over the last 10 years without any debt, as you know. So there's our glimpse at our $67.7 million Windham Southeast School District proposal for next year, and that is very much driven by the goals that Mark has just briefly outlined. I'll do a couple more monologues and then we'll go for questions, if that's all right. Very good. Page 3 is some highlights. We'll continue to add to the highlights, but this is sort of just the beginning, and some of the this is a fiscal report, so fiscal highlights. Overall, I'm just pointing out that $794,000 is the difference between the two periods, this year versus the proposal. And we're going to talk a little bit about those tax rates on the next page, so we'll come back to that. our spending per student, 14,850 this year, 15,940 next year. So we'll talk about that as well. Even though our spending is only up 1%, we receive a statistic from the state that weights our students, and if our student count goes down and our spending doesn't go down at the same amount, then our spending per student would go up. Of course, that's just basic math, and we'll talk about the impact of that on the tax rate. The really important news, probably most important single number on the page is, from my point of view, is that we are under the threshold of 16,108. So this proposal does not trigger the tax penalty for spending more than that threshold figure that is, I believe, is probably 99% accurate or firm, but I am waiting for the agency of Ed to confirm that number. You see our long-term weighted average figures are there, very flat, not much of a change. And that's where when enrollment growth doesn't exceed spending growth, then cost per student goes up. Major cost drivers is the next points on the document. The single highest category of spending increases is in healthcare. It's very unusual that would exceed increases in wages, but it does. And to give you a little bit of a context there, wages you see are up 691,000, but healthcare is up 708,000, and wages, the baseline is 30,500,000, and that baseline is generating the 691,000 in increased spending, whereas healthcare, the baseline is 8.2 million, and yet because of the level of inflation on 8.2 million, it's exceeding the inflation on a 30 million baseline. It's like incredible how healthcare spending is accelerated. At one time, I believe healthcare spending was about the same portion of the state GDP as public ed. And I believe public education in Vermont, Emily may know this statistic, I haven't seen an updated one, but is about 6% of gross domestic product in the state of Vermont. Public ed, about 6%. Healthcare used to be that, 2012. Today, the last statistic I heard, it's 19%. So it's phenomenal how far that is outrun just about every other sector in the economy. Our third largest single cost driver, as you heard for those folks that were part of the supervisory union review, was in special education, and that relates to meeting the needs of our students with IEPs. Now, obviously, those three numbers add up to more than the 794,000 total increase. That means there were cost reductions, and that's what you see on the next line. And that's primarily we've done a lot of projects, and we don't need to continue to spend at $6 million a year. The proposal now is closer to $3 or $4 million a year, and that reflects a significant reduction in spending, and that's why our total increase is the 1.2%. That's a contributing reason. A couple other statistics there. We've got enrollment. And then total employment. And as you see, total employment is proposed to be down 10 positions. Again, that's how we can have all of this inflation, but come in with a budget at about 1% change. So the last page I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on is page 4. This is that difficult to read document that the agency of ed creates the format for, and then we're required to share it with the public. They haven't created the document yet. The agency has not created the document yet, so I took a shot at it. And I won't get into all of the details, but it does require a bit of an explanation in that the way in which the funding formula is presented and calculated has changed. So Sean would recognize right off the bat, and maybe the other finance committee members would recognize, fiscal year 25 I restated. The bottom line taxes that show up in folks' mailbox on the very end of page 4, fiscal year 25, those numbers down there, Brattleboro, $1.93. You should recognize that. That's what you're paying in taxes this year. I didn't restate that. That's happening. Dummerston, $1.78. You see those figures down at the bottom? Those are on your tax bills. Guilford, $1.56, and Putney, $1.35. Those are CLA adjusted tax rates. The reason why I had to restate everything else is because Act 183 changed the way in which the yield is presented. So you may remember we went over the commissioner's tax letter, and it was part of our overview at the December 4 or December 10 or 11 meeting. And there was one little sentence in there with no explanation, but just a little sentence that says you can't compare the fiscal year 26 yield with the fiscal year 25 yield. And the reason why is the law has now applied the CLA adjustment to the yield figure, not to the school board's tax rate. So again, for like folks that remember the current year, on line 12, our tax rate this year that the board presented to the public was $1.50. But to restate the data so that you can compare the numbers, that number is $1.98, because the restated yield, so you have a comparative number, is $7,469. That's the first number on page 4 in column 2025. So if you looked at your annual report, that number was 9,893. That's what the legislature set in June, July last year. And that produced those tax rates I just said. But then Act 183 went into existence, and they changed the way they apply the CLA. So if you want to compare those numbers, I had to attempt to restate the yield and then the board equalized tax rate so you could compare the two. The good news is when we do that, it appears that most of our tax rates would go down if what we know today survived through June legislative session and this budget was passed. Dummerston is the only one that appears to have a increase in projected property tax, and I suspect that is because I believe Dummerston is the only town that hasn't gone through a reappraisal recently, and that generally reflects a deviation from tax assessed value that's greater than 20%, 25% of market. These numbers are definitely going to change, but Mark and I have looked at this very carefully, and it's somewhat of a relief that this is our starting point, and it's not what we were looking at last year, where we were looking at these 10 and 12% increases. Had nothing to do with our spending. It had to do, again, with the CLA changing so dramatically in our region. So that was the overview I wanted to provide. The rest of the summary reports on page 5 and 6 are what we typically share with the board at this point. Page 6 does refer to our fund balance, which is definitely being utilized for the purpose that it's there for. That's to smooth out tax fluctuations. Way too early to tell if a placeholder of 750,000 is an appropriate number at this stage of the game, but we'll definitely be looking at that. And then, as I said, pages 7, 8, those are the revenues we reviewed. They will change based on the career technical ed data and other correspondence from the Agency of Ed. Page 10 is the summary of the capital plan. The detailed plan is on the website. And then the rest of the document is essentially what you've seen from the presentations that we referred to earlier. So that was my overview.
Tim.
So that was a wonderful overview, and I'm sure everybody here appreciates the incredible work that you've put into this. I think this year you've seen more interest in the budget from members of the public, leadership councils, and this is only a good thing. I think we agree on that. But my question is how to address the many very specific questions and suggestions that I, as a board member representing the public, received from various members of from other people. They're very specific. Some deal with equity between boys and girls sports, about suggestion for presentation of the capital expenditures, the pie chart suggestion. Board members, I think, would like to have a breakdown of the board budget. That $250,000 where I have no idea how that's broken down.
We could look at that on.
Well, let me just go through the list of questions. Co-curricular activities, capital plan summary, consultants. How do we determine how to pay our consultants? And how many consultants are not grant funded? And how are their fees determined? What are they used for? So there's all these questions. What's the best way of getting answers to them?
It's great to raise the questions in the board meeting, and then everybody can hear the question and contemplate the implications. Sean generally can answer all of the questions because he looks at the warrants. You had emailed some questions, and I forwarded those to Chris Sawyer. He did a great job giving us a summary this afternoon, so that can be shared. But it is helpful to have those questions at the board meeting, so board business is done in a warned board meeting, as opposed to individual, requests from individual members. I know the board code of ethics suggests that that's the way you'll operate, as opposed to individual members approaching individual people, employees, other than the superintendent.
I think we agree, and this is a board meeting, so.
Yeah, this is a good time to address those questions. I think
Okay.
It's easy to address most of those directly right now. And sometimes there'll be questions that will require a second look. So for example, board business, we've gone over that in the district-wide proposal back in November. If you look at page 172 of the handout, that identifies the line items in the board budget.
Okay, what page should you say?
Page,
172.
it's
Okay.
the, yeah, it's the,
Which page?
it's, if you're looking at the
172.
landscape version,
Yeah,
then it's
yeah.
172. If you're looking at the portrait version, it's 192. Right, so you've got a document that starts from page 1 to 225, but the accounting system puts out its own page numbers. So if you want to look at the If you want to look at the portrait format, it's page 192. The accounting document on the landscape is page 172. So you have here your board proposal, $250,000 for fiscal year '26. Pretty level funded from fiscal year '25 of $248. The actual spend was $194,682 in fiscal year '24, and you know the single largest item has been this reserve that you've carried for professional legal services. Everything else in this budget has been reasonably, sustained over the last 3 years.
Frank, can you clarify that, what you just said? The line item, other professional services, that budget line item encompasses professional fees like legal services, and that would be related to any legal services we have, including the work that was done with the sexual abuse investigation, any other legal services that are related to the board specifically, is that
Yeah, it's
true?
specific to Windham Southeast School District, yeah.
So that includes fees paid to the attorney that the district uses?
Yes.
Okay. Are the fees to that particular attorney, is it a retainer or is it on a issue by issue basis?
It's the one expense I don't look at.
I'm sorry, say it
It's
again?
the one expense I don't provide oversight. So Mark sees those, it's confidential, and I'm pretty sure it's billed on a service, an hourly service basis. But I don't look at the invoices. It's the one area that's confidential, and it's between superintendent and whatever happens in executive session and the attorneys.
There are times when individual board members might reach out to that attorney as against it filtering through some central location like the board chair.
Yeah.
And that's quite an expense under those circumstances. Okay,
Yeah.
just confirming that, okay.
And then, as I said, Chris Sawyer did a really nice job. I just saw the correspondence. We can go over that now if you'd like, on some response to questions around spending. I did look at all co-curricular spending at the secondary level at UHS. It's remarkably similar between girls and boys sports. And it has been consistently over the last period that I looked at, which is these 3-year periods. But did you wanna visit that?
The big question was, so football gets $54,182. How is that compensated for girls' sports?
Yeah, Chris makes a note. First of all, it's actually not designated as a boys' sports. It is a all-gender sport, but the reality is, and the spirit of the question is, not a lot of girls participate. I don't know if any girls participate, but
Not this year. There have been.
there have been.
Are we talking about football?
Yes.
Right now, okay, I just wanted to be clear, got it.
Yeah. He makes a note that there are a few girls' sports, like softball and other sports that are specifically for girls. But But it is part of the VPA, organized athletic events that exist in high schools. So, Mark, I remember him addressing that somewhere in his review. I don't know if you had a specific, like things like cross country, Nordic, track and field. These are all both gender sports.
Can I just ask, are you looking at a document that you've just gotten from Chris Sawyer?
This is a
We don't have it
yeah.
yet.
This
We
is a
don't have
narrative, but I'm glad to forward it along.
Yeah, we do need to see that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you did a nice job putting together a table of notes. So when we look at so things like field hockey and gymnastics are both girls' sports. There's not like a specific boys' alternative, but that is where you do have sports that are specific to gender. I think that's going to change if it hasn't already changed. But when you aggregate the whole system, the spending is very, very similar.
Well, I think that's would clarify things if we just had a bottom line figure. How much is spent for boys' sports? How much for girls' sports? How much for both boys and girls' sports together? Those three figures would clarify a lot of things.
Sure, we can send you the document. I'll just forward the document that Chris has put together today.
Okay, I'm just gonna call on board members first. Kim Price.
I think we should also have clarifying information on that in terms of the numbers, because the numbers on a football team are much larger than the numbers on a girls' or a boys' basketball team, where you have 12 to 15 members at most, and football can have 40 to 50.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So maybe breaking it down price per athlete, cost per
Yeah,
athlete.
he's basically got that information in here. Yeah.
Okay. Lila?
I feel like looking at the document would be a good thing, but my question was that a while back, I think I asked this was one of my issues that I was going to talk with the board about, the kind of like the equity between girls and boys sports, not equality, but equity. And I interviewed one of my friends about this, and what she had to say was that the whole football field got like remade so that they would play the game better, but it took like 2 or 3 years for this softball team to get better uniforms. So that was the question of like the importance. But then again, there are other aspects that ties to it, the school spirit regarding the football teams. And I will play a little bit of a devil's advocate. Many times our football team has not been very successful. The scores show that. Not to say that, our school is still very much like supportive of the team. Every year during homecoming games or whatever the games are for the football, almost all of the recs for the students are filled. However, many times the girls' sports are not shown the same level of commitment or spirit from the school, which could be another reason as to why there's not the equity that's been shown in the prices. But I feel like if the equity will be shown in the support for the girls and boys teams, there will be more school spirit. Because if the school is in a way supporting one type of sport more, there will all just be more spirit from the students. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Yeah. Good point. I've been looking for a file that I had sent to Chris as a little background to speak to that. And again, there's another file I can just send to folks. So for the budget, you're looking at all boys sports in this WHS budget. All boys sports in 2026, 270,000 is in that as a proposed budget. All girls sports, 262,000, and all the co-ed sports, which also includes the athletic director and the athletic trainer, 416,000. So very close between boys and girls specifically, and that is assigning the football to boys, which I think is reasonable, even though Chris is pointing out it's not restrictive. That's the current year. So then we go to the middle year on the budget page here. And it's boys, 262,000, girls, 264,000. And then the total between both genders, meaning no gender specificity, 380,000.
Are you on a specific page on the budget?
Yeah, I'm basically adding up all of the data that's in the secondary budgets. And
I think it's page 51 or so is when the sports section of the VOHS budget
that's right.
exists.
Yeah.
51.
Yeah. And as I say, I can send you this file that just adds those numbers up.
Great.
And then, so that's the middle year, a little bit more spent on the girls' sports than boys, but basically the same. And then you have the actual fiscal year 24. Boys 326,000, girls 317,000, and the non-gender specific 371,000. So again, very, very similar spending patterns. And of course, there's going to be variability based on the number of kids participating, the number of games that get played versus those that get canceled. You know, yeah. And then you may recall we, speaking to the uniform issue, we essentially refreshed all of the uniforms when we rebranded to the Bears logo. So everybody got upgraded for that cycle.
Can I ask a question related to that? So in looking at the budget, does the update for logo stuff live under supplies? I noticed a considerable increase in the actual versus the amended, mostly in the world of supplies.
Yeah,
Is that why?
Yeah. Linda, just a couple other things. There is an athletic leadership council at the school that meets regularly, and that's focused on student voice and feedback. Megan Pacheco is if you're aware, So she'd be a good person to reach out to potentially talk to that group as well. And there's a girls' basketball game happening right now.
Right now,
If folks want to go support that after our meeting.
know.
Other questions? Yeah.
Well, let me just say, I know Tim went through a list. So,
Not finished, but yeah.
so I sent that around to everyone, so it's not a surprise. And, I'm looking at the list right now.
Okay. Oh, should I proceed? Just to stay on sports for a minute. You didn't mention the expense for lighting, which is a very good thing for girls and boys, to give more opportunity for boys and girls to play under the lights, which is a big deal. And that's a good thing. But getting to that, there's a request that in the capital plan, that the notes be written more for the public so that we can understand those notes. For example, it's unclear in the notes what is allocated for consultant fees versus allocation for actual work on projects such as Tenny Field and other projects. So it's just a request that those notes be, when those notes are included in the capital plan, they'd be clear to the public what they're for.
Yeah, so the notes generally are not part of the annual report. They're essential for the administration, and it's helpful for this purpose, the formative part of developing a capital plan. But capital plans generally don't have narrative in them just because they would become unmanageable. But we certainly do want the public to understand each one of those investments and why we're doing those investments. So in the formative process, we can update those, but if we start writing a little book to each project, you'll quickly have literally a 200-page document, and it will be unmanageable. So we'll find the balance on that, but those notes are generally not part of the published plan, and that would be very unusual for a capital plan to have a lot of narrative. It's not unusual for the capital plan to have a preface, with, hey, these are our goals, this is the progress we're making, here's the priorities, and I generally do that in January. This time of year, with one business administrator, there's only so much I can do in a week and a half.
Yeah, I think for some of the big ticket items, it would be good for the public to know, well, why is it important this year for the lighting? If we're really looking at reducing the budget as much as possible, can things like that be postponed? Just questions like that.
Well, to speak to that, I mean, this is a good time to ask those questions,
Okay.
and then we get the feedback. We addressed the Sawyer Field lighting as we were finalizing the improvements to Tenny Field. These are all connected assets. They all are related to the athletic program and the campus, and this issue of equitable access to activities. Sawyer Field has not been an option to light, and it has been perceived by the athletic director as a compromise on equitable opportunity for an extended play versus Tenny and Natowich. And the reason why it hadn't been pursued, I know we've covered this in the capital plan discussion that you probably have not heard, and that is because Act 250 years ago said there's too much of a distraction from the highway going by UHS campus, can't do it. But with the advent of LED lighting and a different design, we initiated that analysis through a consultant, of course, because we don't have the expertise to do it in-house. And then we applied for a permit review, and it was granted to our, surprise, and that was just recently. So as a result of that, we're pursuing that project, and that is why the time frame is what it is. It's the first time that we've had the opportunity. Our capital plan is already reduced by over $1 million, but it does include the Sawyer Field lighting project, and we see this as an important equitable investment in terms of expanding where the girls' sports have been played, so that there is more opportunity there.
It just provides more flexibility for all sports, both genders.
Sure. Appreciate the responses.
I'm just gonna move this around a little bit and then we can come back. Sean Murphy?
Yeah, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the capital plan and specifically about Sawyer Field. As many of you know, I wrote a little narrative answering some of the questions as best I could. And the $425,000, it has a note on the capital plan as of May 24, exploring lighting Sawyer Field to alleviate Title IX issues. So there's a perfect example of how well crafted this capital plan is. Is everything outlined? No. But Frank has gone over this innumerable times. So we spent a lot of time talking about the capital plan and how it is derived. You know, it starts with when it was built, like Tenny Field, the date was, or it's actually, 1940. So, and then it goes through every year and it figures out, depreciation. When do we have to put more money into a specific thing? But it's not like a preordained document. It's a living document that has to be flexible in order to meet the needs of gender sports and also limited field space. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Eva Nolan.
Thank you, Frank, for this presentation. It's amazing.
Sure.
Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you, Emily, for your presentation as well. I also what our student rep talked about equity was so impressive, and I just found the conversation really enlightening, and I hope that we hear more about that, because I just thought the way that it was laid out, it wasn't just about funds, it was also about like school spirit and like how we invest in the culture, and I just found that conversation and how it was worded to be so important, so thank you. The one line that is sticking out for me is on the major cost drivers, where it talks about the reduction of positions, and then it says, but includes salary and wages to be negotiated. Could you just give a little bit more explanation about that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a freeze, or what is happening there?
It is an extension of what we did in March. So in March 2025, or it was March of 2023 that we passed the current budget, and in that time frame, we said we can't pass along 15% increases in taxes, so we're going to freeze $800,000 of spending and then use reserves to essentially buy down the tax rate. So we've maintained those frozen staffing assumptions. That was, I think it was about 6 positions. And that's carried into this 26 proposal. Fortunately, those were not layoffs. They were positions that were either to be hired that we simply didn't recruit for. And again, these were identified through each principal's recommendation. And then in addition to those 6, we've identified 4 additional positions in this period that, again, not layoffs, but positions that principals have said we can reorganize in a way that will still address student needs, but not need the position. And that is also, keep in mind, in the context of a smaller enrollment. So we do have fewer students. And over time, staffing has to reflect, our student enrollment. Otherwise, our cost per student becomes unaffordable. So that's a little bit of a context.
So so these are positions that are not, they're frozen positions?
They're not hired, they were budgeted in 25,
Okay.
but we have said we can organize in a way that still meets students' needs without those 10 positions.
Okay, I was a little confused about how that's like if it's a reduction in spending, and it just, excuse my ignorance.
No,
I'm confused about like how that's like a spending increase if you're reducing.
Well, it's the folks that are still employed are
Okay.
still getting a raise. That was the second part of your question.
Okay.
Yeah, so we are in the middle of negotiations, so we had to make an assumption. Normally, we're not in the middle of negotiations, so we just go to the future wage schedule that has been agreed to, and we put it in. In this instance, we've had to make an assumption of what that future wage schedule will be. And it's, I've mentioned it's largely informed by the Federal Reserve Board's wage inflation forecast over the next 2 years.
Ruby.
I have a question that's specifically related to this as well. I guess I just need you to re-articulate this so I completely understand it. When I look at the total enrollment and the change between the, fiscal year 25 and 26 proposed versus the total number of employment or people employed between those, it feels, the reduction of 10 staff members feels like a lot in comparison with the reduction in the number of students. And so, but you said something that this is reflective of the lower enrollment overall. And so I'm wondering if there's a trend that might be helpful in looking back further into the past to see, like maybe 10 years ago we had like 4,000 students, and so the relationship between the number of staff to students would be really informative to right now, because right now it feels like a pinch, when in reality if we're looking at the longer trends, that's an assumption I'm making, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think the more relevant statistic is that 16,108, it's the excess spending penalty. Mm-hmm. And without that reduction, we would trigger that penalty. So rather than looking historical for some sense of guidance, it's really what are the conditions that we're going to be facing fiscal year 26. And the legislature said, don't cross that line or else we're going to penalize you. And that is very much one of the, first of all, what are our student needs? What do we need to achieve those goals that Mark outlined? And then how can we staff our system and not exceed that spending penalty, and those positions are essential in meeting that balance.
And do you, would you say that those positions that are either not being filled or being reduced, are they coming from a relatively even spread across the district in terms of from each school?
Yeah, they are. Just really quickly, Academy, our largest elementary school, had 2 of the positions. The high school, obviously about half the district, had 5 of the positions. Dummerston 0.8, Putney 0.4, the middle school one position, Green Street 1 position, and I believe that was Title I, which means it's not a local decision, it's federal funding. Green Street was the 0.4 foreign language, and then Nancy had some changes with curriculum to 2 positions, so it's a very even distribution, but most importantly it is from the principals. It's not like Mark and I dictating anything. It's saying how can we meet these student needs, meet those goals, and with that staff. And again, just reiterate, we're really pleased that it's not sending somebody a layoff letter. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, Sean Murphy, I just had a question. What you just referred to, wasn't that this spending freeze assumptions that you passed out?
That's it.
And so that shows, every school and every, the enrollment, the FTE, it shows everything. And then the amount that is reducing it. So That was all planned and actually passed on last March. And then another thing that I'd just like to touch on, that Frank just mentioned, is the spending cap didn't exist. But last year, the legislature said, okay, we're gonna put the spending cap back, which I think was an attempt to try to lower the heat a little bit in terms of liability for property owners. And so this budget has been carefully crafted by administrators and Frank and Mark, with many reports to the Finance Committee and to the full board. It reflects that we're $168 per student below the spending cap. So as Frank has said numerous times, and I'm sure Emily would concur, you don't want a district that goes over the spending cap because, well, to begin with, what would happen is the budget wouldn't get passed. And so if the budget didn't get passed, then you'd have to start all over. It takes a lot more time. And then you don't have a budget, so the whole hiring process is impeded. And so I think it's really important to keep all these things in mind. And originally, the cap was supposed to be, I think it was 2029. There was going to be no spending cap, but now there is again. So, and it's a damper. It's a damper on education spending statewide to try to make it all work. So,
Yeah, that's correct.
Tim?
A very specific question about the line for the athletic director at BUHS. It showed a 22.97% increase for that line. What is that about?
That's where, prior to Hannah, is Hannah with us today?
She just stepped out.
She just stepped out.
Basketball.
She's in the game. The one that your daughter's playing in?
Yes.
Oh. Yeah.
Mark. Bye, Mark, goodbye.
Yeah, we should go. Yes, previously to Hannah, there was a practice of having the current position be the department head for PE, department head for driver's ed, and then also I think a stipend for maybe one of the sports teams.
Yeah.
And so those were reported in those cost centers, and Hannah had asked for that to be consolidated into the position that typically an athletic director would be serving. So it's not that the position's getting a 22% raise, it's just consolidating compensation into the one account number and not assigning it to those other departments.
I think it brings more clarity to the budgeting process as well.
So that 22% increase is not for one person?
Right, it is not.
Okay, thanks. Then, last, I think, a pie chart. Everybody loves a good pie chart. Would it be possible to have a pie chart showing major expenses for the capital plan? For example, a slice for athletics, a slice for energy sustainability, a slice for facility expansion, a slice for technology infrastructure, and so on.
Anything's possible, but we do have to follow that back page, this uniform chart of accounts. So that, that is not the way capital plan is coded. The uniform chart fortunately requires capital improvements to be coded consistent with the type of improvement that's being acquired. So there could be some kind of a separate document created, but it would not be something that I could wire into the accounting system and produce. But like I say, anything's possible. So we could take a look at it.
Okay, that's all for me.
Thank you, Tim.
I'm gonna articulate three questions I have just quickly, and then you can respond to them. First, I'd like to understand, I appreciate that you pointing out where the board budget is, and I wanna understand when we as a board are going to be reviewing that and discussing it. So that's question number one. Question number two is, in looking back at this, the reduction in staff, I'd like to hear specifically, and I recognize that there was that freeze document from last year, but with the additional four, are any of those staff that are not being replaced or reduced in the world of mental health and wellness support for our kids, like social workers and things like that? And then the last question, and this is, I think, a bigger one that I don't really know. It's a bigger one. So we've heard about the SU's decision related to a change in our food service. And I realize that that's an SU budget item, but where I don't understand is how does that, we have to see, that has to hit the SD budget somehow. And I really struggle at seeing that. And so I was curious, thinking about, well, what will it look, where will we see a change? When that's a really big change that we would see on the horizon. I realize that you're probably still working out the numbers for that, but ultimately, how would we see that in our budget?
Yeah,
so those are my three questions.
Yeah, you missed the meeting, the SU meeting where we covered that, and the answer is the pandemic created a situation where we had for many years billed the districts to balance the food service fund and the supervisory union. That could range from 200 to 400,000 between, we're all separate systems, 7 separate systems. And then we were consolidated, and bam, within the first 6 months of being consolidated, COVID hit, and we went into this very different mode of public education. The budget process still assessed the historical amount to balance the food service fund, but the USDA and then later the Vermont state, after this session and after our annual meeting, came in and said, oh, we want to make sure you do everything you can so you're putting food on the bus even though there's no kids there, and you're sending meals out. And we did that, 3,000 meals a day for quite a while. The point is that they fully reimbursed us. It created a deferred revenue. And for fiscal year 26, we're proposing to get a higher cost of doing business, probably about 300,000, funded with that deferred revenue. It's on our balance sheet at the supervisory union. That will wipe that out. And so it wouldn't be until fiscal year 27 that we say, well, how did we do? We've got to hire 18 people to do what Cafe Services is doing. Are we meeting student needs? Are we meeting those dietary requirements, the nutrition standards? If we're doing great, we'll roll out a budget, and it will probably be a $300,000 bill coming to Vernon and Windham Southeast School District. And it will be a line item in this budget.
It is a line item in the district-wide section of this budget?
It would be, yeah.
Okay.
Social work, mental health, no. The answer is no. There's most of the reductions are in like an AST or a planning room support. We consolidated collegiate high school in counseling position. But no specific mental health related positions reduced. And then the board budget, you can talk about the board budget anytime you want. Normally, it would have been discussed when it was presented in finance, which was back on November, I think it was either the 12th or the successor meeting, but you can talk about it anytime.
So that might be something we wanna put on the agenda for the 14th.
Yeah, I think that my recollection about last year is we kind of fumbled with the board budget and it took us a while to figure it out. And then we discussed it in a board meeting and then kicked it back. And it felt like it was later than, maybe it should have been. And maybe there is a way in which your, like Frank, your kind of timeline, maybe we as a board need to pay closer attention, or maybe there needs to be added if there isn't already something that.
It should just be part of that finance committee meeting when that segment of the budget is presented, and that's the purpose of those finance committee meetings, is to get input. We receive quite a bit of input from leadership councils, obviously a lot of input from principals and various groups, but that's the purpose of those multiple meetings in November and December, and then knowing that we have second draft scheduled for January 14 if needed. I'm sure there'll be AOE statistics that will give us more insight, and then potentially another meeting with revisions if needed on January 28th.
Yeah, I would appreciate a conversation at at the board level. I personally, I'm on the finance committee meeting and I don't feel like it's a space that's sufficient in terms of truly engaging the full board and getting feedback. So I think that it would be appropriate to bring it to the board.
Okay, so it'll be on the agenda as we look at the second draft of the budget, that we focus sometimes very specifically on the board budget, and we certainly need your input on that, and in terms of answering.
There's not a lot for me to provide an input. It's just a little bit of supplies. Your board stipends are voted on at the annual meeting.
Yeah.
So the only one that is somewhat material is the professional service legal, and I generally don't have an opinion on that.
It seems, I don't know that we want to discuss it right now, but just from what I saw, it's, the legal is as high as it was last year. So we know what the requirements were last year. They're not the same this year. So I would think it would be significantly reduced.
It's cheap.
But, Kim,
And I
go
would
ahead.
think whatever we don't use, and obviously would just carry over to next year's budget.
No.
Not carry over, but it would go back into.
It just becomes part of the
Yeah.
surplus.
Yeah. But I don't know that that's what we want to do this year, for it to carry over, for it to roll over into a surplus for next year, when our goal is to have tight control over this budget.
Right,
In
yeah.
terms of
I would
lowering
suggest-
expenses. I
I
don't know if that makes sense.
would suggest, revisiting that based on whatever the circumstances that you envision needing legal services for, and then, as every year, that's what we do. We make an estimate on
Right,
every one of these 4,000 line items that are in this budget.
right.
Yeah, and for me, I wouldn't need a meeting to do that. You could simply send me an email that says, we think 100,000 is adequate, and I'll just make the change. But generally, I don't change the board budget. It's, I just copy the prior year in, and then you folks decide what you want to do.
I think we have to have an open discussion about that on the 14th.
Though we cannot get too in depth. We'd have to go into executive session.
To talk specifics about
Yes.
last year versus this year.
Yes.
I was thinking that, I'm very aware of that, right. I'm looking at Ruby as she's mulling this over.
No,
right now.
I mean,
You're-
I think there's lots to be discussed around our spending. I don't think it's all in legal. When I look at that budget and our actual versus our, amended budget, we overspent on a number of categories. Did we overspend enormously? No. But like, what was our spending? Why were we spending? You know, do we need to like seriously look at what kind of travel we have? What kind of, you know, what were our supplies? Why did we have so much printing? You know, like those are questions that I think we could ask, and I can articulate them, and I can articulate them to Mark and to Frank and to Deborah in advance so that we're, you know, but I think we should all as board members be doing that. And I think if we're, you know, as Tim has mentioned, the public is scrutinizing us. And so I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't ask those questions about every line item.
I think some of these same questions that we're asking, I see your hand, just wait 1 second. I think some of the questions that we're asking having to do with the board budget need to be asked of the admin budget as well, in terms of spending costs. And it might be that we want all retreats. This came up somewhat, I think at the last meeting, that we might want all retreats to be done in-house as a cost saving at this point. I know that board retreats are done in-house on one of our sites. It's not optimal, but it is perhaps to be recommended in as a show of good faith, which is what we're talking about right now. So I think both sides need to consider this issue. Sean, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I would go back to, it was actually Ruby's question, I think, about the draft budget presentation to the board. So here we are on the 17th, and then there's going to be on January 14th, and then we go to January 28th, which is the evening that we're slated to approve the budget. And I asked Frank, isn't there an importance of making sure that that happens in order for us to get to March 18th?
Yeah, the 28th is important just so that it allows the budget annual report, which is a required, you know, legal document to be distributed, to be shaped and then printed. And then also the warning date is, you know, it's a statutory requirement that February 11th. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. But the board has to act on the warning very close to the 11th of February. And if you delay the vote on the budget much after the 28th, then you're potentially going to be late on the delivery of the annual report, and that would not be good.
Yeah, but you
Because
just
I
said,
would push at the annual meeting.
Can't change the annual meeting because that has to be changed at an annual meeting.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
okay, so you just said there's wiggle room on the 28th. If by chance the board is still discussing these issues, you need the board to make a decision before February.
Well, it should be on the 28th, but
So what's the wiggle room? That's what I'm asking.
you probably have, you know, I think that's your standard
It's a board meeting date.
Tuesday,
Yes.
yeah,
Mhm.
what is that, fourth Tuesday?
Yes.
So, you know, you probably could do something that following week.
Okay, all right. And that would mean a special meeting to
Sure.
have that vote. We very much want to stay on the 28th. I appreciate that, and which means these issues need to bubble to the surface on the 14th. Eva Nolan.
I'll be real quick. So I just want to say I'm really, I know we're still in conversations and there's a lot more meetings to come, but I'm really happy that we're maintaining the staff level positions that we already have. And that makes me really happy to hear. And I'm sure a lot of teachers are really happy to hear that too, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask just a side question about the electric buses, because I remember there was a grant for it, and I don't know if it's I heard there was like an update about it, and I don't know if it's on the budget this year. Is there hope that we can get it? Is it coming
Yeah.
or?
Yeah, the EPA's next round of applications are due January 9, and I'm working with Beacon Mobility to submit that application. We'll do everything we can to make our case. All rounds, the applications have been enormously popular, and we haven't been selected, but we'll continue to pursue that.
If you do get it, I think we should celebrate the first bus going up. I did have one other slight, it's like a suggestion about the fields, especially tennis fields. So for instance, I looked at the budget and it was like 50,000 this year, and then it looked like it was like next year it jumps to 230,000, but then it was like previous years it was like around 300,000 to update it. And I'm wondering, because I was thinking about maybe the flood, like there were like floods and things like that might have affected the cost. And I'm wondering, is there a way to present like what the cost is for the field and what the maintenance cost is? And maybe, if possible, if like there's a story about a flood or why the cost went up, maybe that would be helpful to the public. I just offer that as a suggestion.
Mm-hmm. So at the tennis field, there's two components. There's the old grandstand,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the one that will need continuing investment into the future. So that's probably the one that you were seeing with multiple assumptions out into 27 and 28, fiscal year 27, 28. And that is to address the ADA compliance and access, and then the lead paint abatement and sealing. And essentially making it a accessible outdoor facility, but also for learning, creating an outdoor learning space. So that's the nature of that. When you look at the capital plan, and by the way, it's on the website, when you look at anything prior to the current year, those are actual costs spent. When you look beyond the current year, those are our estimates. So if you see the capital plan, I'm looking at it now, you'll see that grandstand is differentiated from the field itself.
Okay.
Most of the expense for the field will be completed this year. But there is a reserve for a future upgrade. I don't recall if we were gonna upgrade the lights on Tenny or what that was in the future. I look at the current year very carefully, and I make sure I know what vendor I need to be ready to engage or consultant to do the design work. But this that's a fiscal year 27, which is not on my immediate radar.
And when we do those major upgrades for the fields, unless there's like a flood, we expect them to last like 20 years, is that what?
80 years, yeah.
80 years,
Yeah,
okay,
that's what we
wow,
have in
okay.
our plan, 85 years, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I'm just going, with board approval, I'm gonna restructure the agenda for the 14th so that the first order of business are budgetary considerations. Let's talk about the board budget. We're looking at a second draft. I'd like to move that up. I'd like to move, there are issues that have come up that I know board members would like to see on this next agenda. I'm gonna put them at the end, and depending upon time, we will either get to it or we will not be delayed until the 28th. So that way there's enough room. I'm not worried about the timing tonight. This is a budgetary meeting and it runs long, and that's the way it goes. Jody.
I know everybody wants to go home, but I have questions.
We are here to address them because it is,
Bye, Eva.
by Eva, because that's what we're about
Well,
this
I've
evening.
been through the whole budget on my
You betcha.
computer, and it's really nice to have the paper, Frank, thank you. And I wanted to comment on the grandstand. Are we really committed to doing that grandstand? Because it seems to me it's a humongous cost for what it's gonna be worth. So I would like you to just scrap that and just deal with the fields and put up a small pair of, some bleachers there or whatever,
We're
but
committed to doing it over time, not as one
I
large
mean, that's
project, but over time.
it's an unbelievably, I realize that people think it's historic and all that,
Racist.
but it's an eyesore, it's an unbelievable thing. But anyway, I'll go to another question. I'm looking at transportation, and I don't know whether it has to do with electric buses or not, but BUHS transportation is up 435.5%. Why?
Well, that is just for the field trips and co-curricular. Which page are you looking at?
I'm not looking at, I just wrote down all my questions. And, you
Yeah.
know, you've got field trip, they're under these sports, well, the field trips aren't, but the sports things are under the sports, but that seems like a huge increase.
Yeah, there has been a lot of variability in transportation vendors and availability. And then there is the frequency. I don't know, Keith, if you have any insight into just the frequency of scheduled games. But that's what would account for a significant increase in the lineup. Did you have the dollar amount?
No, it was just I didn't write it down, Frank, I'm sorry, but I was trying to do it on my computer and I couldn't write on my computer like I can on paper. But Dummerston, for example, was up 25% too, and I wanted to know why.
On transportation?
Yes.
Yeah, and again, that would be a field trip and or they have a little co-curricular as well. Now, many of the schools essentially eliminated field trips during the COVID years, and they're just starting to really get back to where they used to run field trips, and that would account for a significant amount of more spending.
So we're not doing field trips anymore with volunteers. I mean, I've driven many field trips, and
Well, this would be-
you don't do that anymore.
To some extent, but yeah, unfortunately, the rules around how to engage volunteers, we still can, and we do, but they're so much more strict around criminal record checks.
I understand that fingerprinting and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I was just concerned because that looked like a huge increase. The other thing I wanted to suggest, I realize now that you've got the budget under the cap, but I'm not happy just leaving it under the cap. I understand that these principals of the school were asked to keep their budget requests within 2% increase. And I'm looking now at wages, and I'm looking at the principals' wages, and they range from 10.28%, and a lot of them are 5.5%, and some of them are 4.5%. And I'm wondering why, and then also, and I'm speaking directly to you and Mark, that, you know, the superintendents and the treasurers, you know, and the athletic director, like you've explained, and the athletic director at BAMS is 9.7%. Why, when one group is asked to keep it down to 2%, why aren't we saying everybody should be 2% at this particular year? And you'll be much below the cap, but, you know.
Yeah, generally, the professional non-union, so that's the group you're referring to, follow the average result of the teachers' negotiation, because that's the largest group of professional people employed by the district. When you see a variation that seems to be different from one line item to another in terms of principal salary or admin salary, typically that has something to do with the prior year budget not reflecting the the same position. If there was a position change, or if there was, some kind of like a number of days changed, and I believe we did try to standardize all principal days, which accounts for a change in compensation. But typically, in a non-negotiating year, you wouldn't see variation. It is a single assumption that's applied to all non-union professionals.
Well, I've always, since going back years, and I had negotiated a couple of times throughout the years, and I've always been upset with the fact that admins are negotiating teachers and then gain from what you've negotiated for the teachers. So I don't like that kind of situation.
How do you suggest we address that?
I suggest you have a total committee of negotiations and not have the administration involved in it.
Well, we do have a committee, and the law does require the supervisory union, which is the chief executive of, the superintendent chief executive of the board in terms of the statutes. So it's awfully hard to have a negotiation without the chief executive who knows what it takes to be a successful teacher, what's appropriate in terms of working conditions, as opposed to just having folks like an attorney representing the negotiations process and not being an educator. So that would be an odd, and I have not seen that practice before in my 35 years.
I have seen where negotiations have been done with a lawyer. But what kind of, you said it's a state law that it has to be
That supervisory
the admin?
unions have to coordinate.
What's the number of that law?
I don't have that top of my head. I bet you it's Title 16,
It's Title 16 something
probably
or other.
262 is my, but I wouldn't quote me on that.
Okay, well,
But I can get that back to you.
I'm sure you will, because you're very good at getting things back to me.
am.
But I am concerned that the principals and the admins are not taking a less of a cut. I mean, they're not taking, less money when they've requested everybody else to take less money.
Yeah, that's not the case. The principals don't get a bigger raise than the teachers. It's always aligned. But as
I'm
I
not
say,
talking teachers. I'm not talking teachers, I'm talking principals and admin.
that's what I'm saying. They're usually aligned with the teacher contract. We just don't have a contract in place then.
And we're not requesting 2%. We're in a negotiation year, and we do have a committee comprised of 4 board members and members of the administration.
Now, I'm just talking comparable for what you've requested from the rest of the group, rest of the
Sure,
schools.
Yeah, I
That you
understand.
should be requesting from yourselves too.
Jody,
So-
can I?
Nancy, do you want to address that?
Sorry, I just wanna say one thing. So we were asked to budget based on what was going to serve the needs of our students. There was not a percentage given. We are also not, we could not hold the teachers to 2%. We consciously made a decision to try and hold our growth of our budgets to 2% overall. But that was not simply wages, so we cut in places other than wages to get to that 2%. We didn't just say, okay, teachers, you're only getting 2%. We don't have the power to do that.
Now, I wasn't talking about teachers, I was talking about the school as itself. Dummerston was asked to stay within 2%.
We made that decision to stay within, to try and stay within 2%. But to say that we held our teachers to 2% would be incorrect. We did not, we
I'm
don't
not
have
saying that,
control.
I'm not
Okay.
saying the
I'm
teachers.
just saying, but but if you're saying that you think we should hold administrators to 2%.
Well, I'm saying they should
increase
be
staff.
held to some sort of a cut if they're asking everybody else to stay within.
But we
So.
cut our budgets overall to stay within that 2%.
So we didn't cut anybody's wages. We cut in places that were not, because we are negotiating.
I see what you're saying,
Yeah.
but it's just, okay, anyway, I brought that up, that's one of the things I wanted to bring up. One of the other things that I'm wondering is, why is workers' comp up this year so much in different areas?
Those are premiums set by the industry, and we are required to have workers' comp, and it's prevalent across the state. It's not unique to us.
So it's a premium, it's not that you've had a lot of people using workers' comp,
That's right.
so that you're in a position where you have to be
That's
raised.
right. We're part of the state pool.
That's happened, okay. And retirement at BUHS was up to 206.5. I wasn't quite sure what that meant.
So there's a few different types of retirement expenses. So if you gave me an account number, I could be specific, but
I can go back and find it, I'm sure.
Yeah, but in general, there are two types. There's the state law that the legislature passed probably 5 years ago that is trying to address the underfunded status of the teacher retirement system. And it says basically for any new teacher hired that was not previously in the teacher retirement system, the employer has to match a contribution on behalf of that teacher. Otherwise, our long-serving teachers, like Nancy, she pays into the system, but the employer doesn't. It's out of Nancy's pocket. It's not out of the employer. But several years ago, when the state recognized how underfunded the system was, they said, okay, employer, you hire somebody new to the system, you're gonna pay in as well. So that accounts for part of the increase as there's a new hire. The other component that is discretionary is collective bargaining agreement for teachers provides for an employer matched on a 403B plan. So if the employee elects to put in up to 2%, the employer will match that. And that's elective. So when we budget based on what we know is intended by that employee.
Okay.
Doesn't always, work out the way they expected, but the employer always will only participate if the employee does.
Okay, tell me what Sports Central Inc. is.
Sports Central Inc. Where you see
I
that?
can't
as a
tell
line
you
item?
where I found it, but I could go back and find it and let you know, okay?
It's not a familiar term to me.
Well, there's 2 or 3 things in the budget talking about it, so I'll just put Frank on that one. Okay, and police coverage is obviously not under the sport. It's obviously under some other heading.
There is police coverage for events.
For a heading.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not put under football, soccer.
It's a general event.
A general. Yeah, and what is general category?
So there's general instruction. So that's where in the high school you have the curricular areas, English, science, math, social and so on. But then there is a general instruction that serves all of the curricular departments. That would be like a 504 services, or it could be, Hannah's not here, but she would have more examples, or Keith might have a couple of examples of the general instruction support. Like, it used to be maybe like a planning room for you in the middle school, but I know you've changed that model. But it's where you have staff working directly with kids, but it's not a specific curriculum.
Because there were several places where it just said general for a category.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I've asked my most important ones here, except for the porta potties that are on the sports teams. And they evidently, they go into the water and sewer category?
Yeah.
And not a sport category or whatever. They go into, okay. Kind of makes sense. All right. If I have any more questions, I know where to find you, Frank.
Yes, okay, thank you for your
Thank
question.
you.
And I'll get back to you on
Thank
where
you.
I found this. Thank you.
And Jody, as you send questions, would you forward them to me? And that way I can forward the questions at least to the full board so that we can see the direction that.
You want all the questions I asked to be sent to you? Or just the ones I'm gonna talk to Frank about?
Well, I'm not sure how to distinguish the two categories, so so by all means, send whatever you would like to me.
Okay.
Absolutely. Christina Naylor, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Director Stanford. I have two quick comments and a clarifying question. I have a teensy concern about the Tenny Field expenditure and the renovation of it, only because I am concerned about the precedent of in 2018, 2019, we were going to demolish the grandstand to make more room for actual student play in a very prime piece of real estate. And it would have allowed us to have a full-size soccer field in that location. The Friends of Tenny Field said, no, we want to save the field and we will raise the funds to do it. And now they have waited 5 years, and now it appears that our tax base is expending the funds to renovate the Tenny grandstand. And I feel like that's a little bit of a bait and switch for our tax base. And the board at the time, it was a previous board. I appreciate no board can buy the hands of a future board, but the board said that no taxpayer money would be expended to save the grandstand. So I just feel like I want to remind people, many of whom were not on the board at the time, or any board at the time that this was going on, that these expenses were previously said that we were not going to put it on the taxpayer, and we are. So I just want to clarify that. I also am hearing, so that's my first comment. My second comment is I am wondering about board structuring of finance committee meetings so that more board members can participate and understand the budget coming into these sorts of meetings, because there's so many details for Frank to go through, and it's a huge budget and there's a lot to understand. And I hear Sean rightfully saying, well, Frank's gone over this multiple times, but it hasn't always been in the full meeting. And I think because the full board is responsible for approving the budget, the full board should really have a good understanding of the budget. So perhaps in the future, for future budgeting seasons, those finance committees could be include more board members and not just subcommittee meetings where you feel like you're going to get a quick report, because there's no way a quick report can be delivered to the board on a $67 million budget. And that's just my opinion, having done this for a while. And then my clarifying question, and Frank, it is me, it is not you. But you know how much I love page 4 of your report?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Anybody who doubted if I was a nerd now knows I am. So it looks like our equalized pupil number has gone up on that report, and I'm wondering if it's an artifact of the change in the calculation, or if it is some other change, because you were saying that our numbers have gone down, but it appears our equalized pupil number, which is the important calculation number, has gone up.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, that is correct. That's definitely a preliminary number. So I expect to see another version of this probably in early January from the Agency of Ed. Brad James has graciously returned because his replacement left kind of abruptly, the AOE. So they're just kind of patching data together and getting it to us, and Brad has indicated that it's incomplete. But what it does on a preliminary basis, it just reflects that yes, we have a higher weighting in those categories. You know, students eligible for socioeconomic assistance, and our ELL population has grown again. And those have very significantly higher weights. So that's what's offset the reduction in our actual enrollment.
Thank you for the clarification, and great to hear Brad James has returned.
Yes.
Yeah, unfortunately, he says it's definitely temporary. He's told us he's not going to stand with us for the whole session, which is it's troubling because
Perhaps the legislature could make some law about him not retiring. So just a
I would
suggestion.
say Nicole Lee was extraordinarily skilled at her job, and even I love Brad, but Nicole actually built on some very solid systems that Brad had and made them even better. And I think the loss is really losing Nicole. That area of the Agency of Education has, I think, 4 unfilled positions right now. It was not just Brad or Nicole; they both had positions under them that never went filled. And we need better data to make good decisions.
that's for sure.
He was great.
Sorry to just jump in.
No, that's perfect, thank you. Anything else, Christina? Okay, thank you very much. Ruby?
I wanted to take this opportunity to ask something because we are talking about the Agency of Education, and I know that I was told to ask Mark for this data. Do you remember the scatter graph thing? That I feel like we've asked a few different times. Who or which school are we in that? And
You're talking about the green and the red circles?
Yeah, the green and the red circles thing, and I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
On the X and the Y axis.
Yes. So Mark, do you have that? Do you know which one of those circles
I don't know which circle we are. I can speculate that we're a high spending, high achieving school district.
So that the Agency of Education staff person that we saw specifically said, we will send that, we have that information, we will send it to you. They also said no one else has ever asked for that, which seems extremely unlikely. But
She hasn't sent it to me.
she hadn't sent. Yeah,
Yeah,
if you
thank
could,
you.
that'd be great, because I think it's like feels like I don't know why we have to dig so hard for that. It feels like that should be like surface level answer. And it would be fascinating to know.
It's because we live in Massachusetts, that's why.
We are.
Yeah. You are what?
We are one of the higher spending, higher achieving districts in the state, fairly consistently year over year.
Right. That all of that I know, and when we the visual is really important in telling the story and helping us to understand who we are. And so if we're looking at all of those red and green, figures and not really understanding where we land, it doesn't give any weight to what that visual is. Anyway.
Okay. Go ahead.
I mean, in any legislative session, I have piles of charts like that anyone who's sort of watching our work could have access to. I don't think everyone wants all of them, but Brattleboro's, Windham Southeast, is pretty easy to identify in all of them as well. So I can always happy to share those with folks here if they're
I think that would be great, if you would.
I will offer that one of the challenges that my committee has encountered when we look at things like scatter plots is I think people often create correlation or causation when they look at scatter plots that are not necessarily there. And so looking at a scatter plot in a vacuum with no verbal context from the fiscal analyst who's presenting it, we wound up in a conversation about the patterns people see in clouds when they look at the sky very quickly. It was a really fairly wild conversation to watch my committee immediately who look at numbers all day, every day, because that's what we do there. But it was pretty wild how quickly people jumped to stories about the data that were not, did not have the context that they needed. But yeah, happy to send those along from
All right, we are coming up on 9 o'clock, so I'd like to, the rest of the agenda is short and to the point. I certainly do not want to cut this conversation short if there are pressing issues right now. Next meeting, again, anticipate that it will be a good 3 hours that we're sitting here. We have no choice. This is the work of the board, and we are at Academy School on January 14th, so please keep that in mind. With permission of the board, I want to move on to the admin report. Mark, do you have any hires, resignations, retirements?
2 retirements at the high school level. Bruce Holloway, UHS science teacher, and Nancy Johnston, assessment coordinator.
Okay. Is there a motion?
So moved with regret.
With regret, seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. Mark, is there anything else in the admin report?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve, there's only one thing on the agenda, minutes from December 10.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, and we're moving on to new business. Policy and Amendment presents the following for a first reading. C3, public participation at board meetings, and D6, substitute teachers. This is a first reading. Please look at the documents, and this is for community as you're watching this video as well. And any questions or concerns, please email me, and if no comment, we go to a second reading on the 14th. And there are also 2 other policies that will go for readoption on the 14th. Is there any other business before this board?
Madam Chair, there being no further business before this board, I move that we adjourn.
Second, I have a second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? It is 8:58.